Hi everyone, and thank you for coming, both online and in person. I'm Phoebe Davis. I'm a reporter here at Tortoise on our SenseMaker team, and I largely focus on health and education, what we call the 100-year life. And just a little fun fact that I kind of just got told was that the music you came into was I Owe You Nothing by Bros, if you know your 80s boy bands. And it turns out our live editor, Liz Mosley, ran into one of them in Soho about 20 minutes ago, Matt Ross. It's some weird twist of fate. There is photo evidence on the Tortoise WhatsApp chat, so maybe that's fate. It's kind of it was meant to be tonight that he's on Strictly, I think, which is why he's in Soho. Anyway, let's get to the main topic. Although I'm sure we could discuss 80s boy bands most of the evening. Student loans. It's a big topic to kind of tackle. We're going to run this thinking a little bit differently. You'll notice I'm up here alone, which feels a bit weird, but apart from this whiteboard, which I'll come to later. But the idea is that we're going to have a bit of a round table, kind of an open discussion for people who've been to university, a bit of a seminar, maybe. And have a kind of discussion about student loans and, most importantly, whether or not they're working. We're going to focus on the UK system, mainly England, but we will also kind of look to the other nations. We might even consider the US in light of news that a lot of the student loans have been kind of cancelled off by Biden, but mostly we're going to kind of keep it UK focused. And we're going to kind of sit with three big questions. And the room is kind of filled with people who are able to answer, I hope, some of them, and online. And that's if it's working for students, if it's working for universities, and if it's working in general, which is the main goal of student loans, which is to get you to university, get you into employment, and kind of benefit the country in that way. So that's kind of how I would like to structure it. The chances are we're going to get completely derailed and we'll end up in kind of a little hole somewhere. But I know there's also people in the room that can talk about other options and how we can reconsider those. And, you know, we can maybe come to the conversation about student debt in general, whether or not we should, anyway, we've lots of things to talk about and I'm sure we'll come to them. But I think I might start out with the whiteboard because I think to kind of work out if they work or not, we need to understand what student loans are. And for context, I'm 25, so therefore I have a student loan, a quite considerable student loan, because I took a postgraduate course. I'm okay with that. My personal view is that I'm happy that I paid. I see the value in the course. I have a lot of questions about the loan in general, but we can kind of come to that later. But I think I'm going to do a bit of a show of hands in the room and online, which you can just raise your digital hand, is if you think you really understand the system of student loans. Okay, in the room, that's two people. Two people. I'm hoping for more understanding, actually. And online, I can see one, two. Okay, and one of them is from 1KG, so I'd really hope that they can understand that. So I'm going to do a bit of maths on the board, which is going to be fun. So for people that aren't aware, the current system of loans, if you're an undergraduate, and it will change next year, but as a current student, if you're coming into the course this year, that means you basically are coming in when you come out of your student loan. If you earn above the £27,000, £27,295 threshold, you pay 9% of your income above that. And the average student's kind of coming out with about £45,000 of debt. And that's kind of what you're looking at. There's a 30-year wipe-off point, but that's kind of what you're looking at. And thanks to Martin Lewis for doing these calculations for me, we're going to work that out a bit. So, for example, if you're earning about £28,000, that means that you are paying £705 above the threshold and therefore pay yearly about £63.45. And if you're earning £35,000 a year, so this is kind of a few years out of university, likely because it's kind of above the average graduate salary, you're paying £7,705 above the threshold, and therefore paying about £693 a year. So not you know, it's a sum. It's a significant sum when you take it over a yearly basis. It comes out of your monthly paycheck. It comes out along with your other taxes. Obviously, at the moment, other taxes are increasing. But when you look at your monthly paycheck, there's kind of, it works out quite roughly quite well. But if we flip the board, this feels very magical. I know. And you'll see what I did earlier. I feel a bit Blue Peter. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I think it's important to kind of see how we got here. So from 1997 and kind of Blair introducing fees despite saying otherwise. These were means tested. We're kind of talking low threshold, to 2003 when the fees were raised to £3,000 again, even though promises that we weren't going to do so. And that kind of took effect from 2006. From 2009 and Brown increasing a little bit more and freezing financial support. That was kind of a financial crisis measure. 2010, kind of an infamous year, I think, in student loans, a little bit. So that's Clegg and kind of coming forward in the coalition, and then the decision to raise fees to £9,000, which is obviously a significant increase. The 2015, I think, is important, is this kind of repayment threshold U-turn. That was kind of freezing the repayment threshold for a significant period of time, and that is important. And then 2016 is hiking fees to £9,250, which isn't a significant hike, but was in relation to performance at universities to some degree, although most courses do charge £9,250 a year. And then importantly, 2023, which is next year's students, will have their repayment threshold lowered to £25,000. So those sums I just kind of worked out for you, wipe those. And the loan length is extended to 40 years. So if you come out of university as a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, you're looking to be paying your student loan until you're 60. So basically until you retire, or probably beyond that by the time we get to that point. That's really important. I hope that has helped people make sense of it at home and here. But this kind of last point is really significant. I know there's lots of other things in terms of government policy going on right now. And again, U-turn is a familiar word in the student loan world. So who knows, that might happen. But the important thing there is that there's a significantly higher amount of students who will be paying off their entire loan over their lifetime. So for current students, so people like me, sorry Connor, I just smashed the mic, 20% of full-time undergraduates starting in kind of 21, 22 will repay in full. The forecast for 22 reforms, that'll increase to 55% of new students. So I think the advice has mostly been to a lot of students is to not take a gap year this year. That's a significant change to the money that you will be spending. And that is significant. And it's partly significant, as you can kind of see, that even in the last kind of 10 years or so, and I was born in 1997, so over my lifetime, things have changed and they chop and they change. And you really have to be aware of that as a student when you come into making these loan decisions, because things can change and they can change retrospectively. So my loans have changed retrospectively in terms of my income thresholds. So you really have to be hot on what's happening. And I think we can come to that a little bit in terms of education. It's something that Martin Lewis, who's done a lot of work on this, has campaigned on. But that's kind of where we're starting. So I'm going to go to the room and online again, which is, do you think this system of student loans that we've kind of ended up at and are moving towards, do you think it works? No one in the room. Online? No one online. Okay. Oh, one person. Wait, I'm just going to give you your mic, and then if you can say your name, and then I want you to say why you think it works, if that's okay.
Am I supposed to say it works?
No, you can say why it doesn't work.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah,
my name's Cody, and I don't think it works because, as you say, most people in my cohort and every cohort before won't be paying theirs back. And this is because it's an astonishing amount of money. For example, I'm paying £9,250 per year for 3 years, and then I have to pay as well a maintenance loan on top of the tuition, which in my case works out to another £29,000. And that's before even considering doing a master's or anything else. After that, I will have over £55,000 student debt, which how the hell am I going to pay that off unless I earn extremely well? Which in most cases, graduate salaries aren't actually that different to the average national salary, tend to be floating around that repayment threshold. So I probably won't be paying it in significant figures, probably until my 30s. And also, it just seems like it's a way to try and make sure there are less students by punishing those who are going on to university. But that's not working either, because every year we're seeing more and more people go to university, because it's something that's almost kind of expected now. That if you want a decent paying job, that you have to go to university, because a lot of jobs for young people which are in like office industries, essentially, they require you to have a degree because it makes it easier for them to kind of sift through all the applications, not because it's actually any good in terms of preparing someone for a career.
Okay. And so you're a student. Do you mind saying which university and what course?
I'm at the University of Bath doing politics with economics.
Okay. So interest in this subject. So can I ask you a question as well? So I think... So what year are you studying at the moment?
So I'm in my second year.
You're in second year. Okay. So did you come into university kind of aware of the kind of choice you were making and aware that you'd be taking on? And I think it's also good to say that I'm in a similar position. My total student debt is over 57,000. I will not pay all of that off. And it does, in terms of other debts that you take on, it is still a good debt, if you want to call it that, to take on. I think there is something we can talk about, which is about, you know, is it graduate contribution? Is it a tax? Is there different ways of thinking about it? But that doesn't change that money is put against your name. And do you think you've seen a value? Like, do you see the equivalent, like, okay, I've taken on this loan, but it's worth it for the course and the graduate prospects that I'm looking towards at the moment?
Yes and no. I think, as I was saying, because so many more people are going to university, the value of a degree has gone down, really. So the costs are going up, the value is going down. At some point, you've got to say one is kind of crossing the other. I'm not sure which side of that we're on at the minute. Because at this rate, we'll see in the UK what we've seen in other countries in Europe, where now a master's is now what you need to distinguish yourself from other people. And then what happens after that? Do you have to go to a PhD to get proper graduate jobs? That's going to take a long time and a lot of money. It's just not a feasible system. We have to change something much bigger than just putting all the money onto the students to dissuade them from going.
And that's what you kind of see as like the goal at the moment. Okay, that's really helpful. Is there anyone else in the room? I can see a hand up behind you, if that's okay, if your kids pass the mic back. If you just say who you are and where you come from.
Yes, I'm Jim Dickinson from Wonky. The answer to the question for me is both yes and no. And it deserves just a minute or so to explain that. So I worked for the National Union of Students in 2010. And what we were able to do was pretend to the world in our campaigning that the student contribution was roughly tripling, and it wasn't. And what's interesting, I think, about the contribution that you made and you made so far is, to some extent, that signal tuition fee figure is the figure that people focus on. It's the figure that people focus on when they look at the bottom right-hand corner of their student loan statement. But it's got barely any relation to the actual total amount that graduates pay. The reason why, when there was a row between David Willits and Vince Cable in the coalition, the reason why Vince Cable lost the debate around having a graduate tax is really quite simple, because what George Osborne was able to do is give out lots of student loan money and not book the cost of write-off to the public accounts, okay? And he was able to do that because up until that point, everyone had always repaid their student loans in full. Now, that's changed over the past decade, but he was able to look very generous and never account for the write-off cost that was coming at the end of the 30 years, okay? Now, the reality, therefore, is that what that does is it created a system that was really very progressive, okay? The people who do the best, other than the very richest, the people who avoid the loan scheme altogether, the people who do the very best out of being a student, pay the most because they pay interest. and they pay in, the full amount. And students who don't do very well have the loan written off after 30 years and don't pay until they earn a certain threshold. That's very, very progressive, actually. The problem is that if you're a government politically trying to convince citizens in general and students specifically that you're being generous, what you don't do is say, we're giving you a subsidy at the end of your life if you're economically unsuccessful. Because funnily enough, people that are 21, one, don't think about the end of their life, and two, don't anticipate being economically unsuccessful. So the extraordinary thing about the student loan system is it's cleverly quite progressive, but spectacularly difficult to sell to people as being progressive or helpful or fair. And what that results in is things like, a couple of months ago, there was a prospect of student loan interest being very high because, of course, it's based partly on the base rate. And Twitter erupts with, this is terrible, this is usurious, the students are being harmed again. Of course, the only people in the current system that would pay more would be the top 15% of earners, because they're the ones who don't have their loan written off after 30 years. So the only consequence of that group of people not having to pay the additional interest is the Treasury has less money to spend on maintenance loans today. And that's to some extent why maintenance loans this September have gone up 2.3% rather than by the real rate of inflation that real poorer students are facing. So, top is bottom, left is right. The point about the Gordian knot system is every single type of reform to it, everything you do to it, people think makes it fairer, but makes it unfairer, if you're kind of interested in a progressive system. I will stop talking. The one thing I would say, though, is the thing that's, I think, really important is what the figure of 9,250 obscures is, to some extent, the amount that we want graduates to put in versus the state. And the headline figure about the changes that they're intending to make next September is very simple. We're moving from 50p in the pound being put in by the government to 15p in the pound being put in by the government. Put another way, the changes they made to the existing cohort, this is the group of students who had to do Zoom uni, the changes they made just by pausing the rise in the repayment threshold mean that the average student is paying 10k more, not less. So when they were all clamouring for lower fees, over their lifetime on average, they're paying 10k more. And my point about that is, unless we're able to have a better conversation about the split between the state and graduates, and then which graduates we want to contribute and when, we won't get anywhere. And the point about that is that if the debate is stuck in should there be loans or not, we really won't get anywhere, because that misses the opportunity to influence the debate that the government has got away without having over the past 6 months.
And I think that's incredibly helpful to kind of think back in terms of 2010. But that's kind of where personally I've come to, is I've suddenly become very, very bothered by repayment thresholds and the interest rate decision. I think my first reaction was, okay, like, fine, that doesn't change anything to my monthly paycheck. And it was kind of celebrated, and I was like, we're going to freeze the threshold. And I'm like, okay. And again, my question was, but are you increasing in September? Because a lot of the research, and unfortunately someone from Save the Student who did a big kind of survey on student costs, obviously everyone's cost of living is going up, including students. A lot of them are the little pay meters, those ones that are basically crap for kind of managing energy costs. They're left with only, I think it was £50 usually at the end of the month. And it'd be interesting to kind of put in the round as well. It's parents who are going to be kind of footing the bill at that point. So it'd be great if there's any kind of, I might come to Sophie in a minute because I can see the chat is really kicking off, and I think I might come to you to kind of keep up to it. If there's any parents who are like, look, making decisions about their student, because if they are changed, as the repayment threshold is changing, there's a lot of pressure to send your kid to university this year as costs are incredibly high, and that seems really tricky.
I just very quickly wanted to say there's a date that's missing there.
Oh yeah.
So shortly after the snap election, Theresa May, at roughly this time of year, so it was the night before her big conference speech, relatively famously in kind of those sorts of circles, decided to raise the repayment threshold in order to put more money in the pockets of new graduates as a pitch to graduates post the election where the Tories hadn't done well and Corbyn had done well. So she raises the repayment threshold at that point, doesn't run it past the Treasury, and that costs a huge amount of money. And since you've kind of got a revenge position on making young people pay because they're not the people who elect the current government. So,
Okay.
so that date, 2017, straight after the snap election, is really important in the kind of history of the
history of where those points sit. Okay, great. Sophie, is it okay if we come to you just so I can have a little bit of a scan of the chat?
I'm going to do my very best to sum this up, but there has been loads in the chat. Okay, so we started off, firstly, we're talking about the English and Welsh system, which Andrew Girdwood hopefully at some point can tell us a little bit more about the Scottish system. But there was an interesting point, I think, made by Helen about, she was saying she didn't agree with an earlier statement that it's right for students to pay for undergraduate education. After all, graduates eventually pay for their education through taxation, and European countries have a similar, if not better, higher education without the burden of debt to students. So this was kind of echoed a little bit more in the chat about this idea of public good, and that you don't just go to university for the job at the end, but also it's kind of an idea of widening your education and things like that. There was also an interesting point made about hiring and whether or not actually you do need to hire someone with a degree, and that sort of cost benefit analysis of, you know, do I take on that loan in order to get a better salary at the end? And the chat seems to think perhaps not, or at least some people in the chat seem perhaps not. I think it would be great to come to Livia Scott if possible, because she was saying something very interesting about degrees as a whole, and also this idea that it's a kind of you go into university and therefore that is the great leveler, when actually you probably go in and come out a similar socioeconomic level as you went in.
It'd be good to come to, can we come to Daniel Dipper? Is that okay? Daniel Dipper is a regular Tortoise member, so I know he'll have lots of opinions on this. But I think it'd be good to talk about that kind of, one, he's made a good point about costs at university. And I think we're just going to focus a little bit on students, and then we're going to come back to the impact on universities, which I know someone in the room will be able to help me with. But if we get to talk about, hi Daniel, it's nice to see you.
Hello. Sorry I haven't been around for a while. It's been busy. I'm undergraduate president actually here at the college that I study at. So sort of I do deal with some of these issues, I suppose.
Yeah, it'd be great. So could you just give a kind of state of where you think things are in terms of cost of living for students? And also, if you can talk a little bit, because I know you've come on before and talked about how that social mobility point, like the point is to go to university to kind of move forward. And like, do you think that's still an accurate representation of university?
Yeah, so I think in terms of cost of living, I think that my college particularly, Oxford, is particularly lucky that there are lots of bursaries on offer, which not all universities have the resources to offer, and also that, particularly my college is one of the richer colleges in the university. And I'd say, therefore, my experience is only my experience. There are others in Oxford who do not receive half as much financial support as I do, or other colleges with similar financial backgrounds. So that's something to really sort of note, to say that we're in a bubble where we are very lucky. But even in the same university, there are people, no doubt, who are struggling with the cost of living. There are people who work basically most of the holidays flat out. I mean, I did that last year myself. So certainly I do think that there are issues even in Oxford, which I think will most probably be slightly shielded from some of this compared to other universities, which, as I say, won't have that so generous financial support. And I mean, I've, again, been quite lucky that the college has generally tried to keep rent below inflation. We managed to get a below inflation rent increase this year of about 7%. But of course, our student loans are not going up 7%. So that is eating into the amount of money we have. But there are other colleges that have increased prices by 15, 20% sometimes in a year, which is, of course, a huge adjustment to student costs, particularly when Oxford's a very expensive city. So if you're in a college that doesn't offer accommodation, then you're having to rent privately for most of the year. So say cost of living wise, I'm doing okay, luckily. And I think that there is generally support in place to tackle that. There are sort of grants students can apply for throughout term to respond to their needs. But I still think it is a concern. There will still be people working around the clock. And there was the other point as well, I think, in terms of social mobility. I'd say that speaking to students, again, just like most of us didn't quite understand all the changes that have happened to the student loan system, there is lots of anxiety about that debt. People think they're generally going to have to pay that off fully. And frankly, at the rate that they keep increasing the repayment period, it may get to that in terms of the government changes that they keep seeming to be bringing. So debt is something that particularly those from lower social backgrounds, I think, are quite anxious about taking on. And they are concerned about the implications for them. Again, the university provide bursaries so that students actually take on less of their maintenance loan for those from lower income backgrounds, so they have less debt to take forward. But I don't know all universities are in a place to be able to provide that. And I also raised in the chat as well about sort of students, certain religions do ban the taking of debt. And therefore that means that even though the system is sort of meant to be a little bit of a fudge, actually there are students who are excluded from that system because of religious observances, and we do need to take that into account to ensure that everyone can access university regardless of background. Again, Oxford, I think, has a scheme in place to try and respond to those particular concerns. But again, Oxford has lots of financial resources, and not all universities are as lucky in that, and we do need to sort of take that into account. And also, Oxford is one university. We have many, many great universities, and it's ultimately about not just getting in, but actually getting on and doing very, very well there. Just because they've actually got to the university doesn't mean they feel fully integrated. It doesn't mean that, all those concerns have been responded to. And again, just if Oxford had fixed something, well, of course it's Cambridge, but actually there's all these other, Russell Group and top universities that aren't in the Russell Group that actually put a lot of value to the local economy, to students, to the wider country. And it's about the support that students are receiving there.
Some really good points. I think I'd like to come back to something that we've kind of just had a chat about, which is the way that we see debt. So to the government at the time that they made those decisions, it was kind of good, right? Like they took that as a bank would, they would take it as an asset almost, because it's a long-term pay. Whereas again, like Daniel mentioned, the conversations around debt, especially at the moment, among kind of some social classes, it's incredibly, it's not a good word. It's kind of a fearful word. And then also there's lots of conversations around that need to be had, and that's where the language is really, really key. And I think, obviously Oxford is one university and has its own kind of practices, but it'd be good to kind of chat a little bit, if we can bring the mic over, about each university's reaction, because one of the things that is important to say is obviously when they put in the 9,000, the idea was it's going to be competitive, it's going to be this kind of marketplace. And what happened is everyone charged £9,000. So that's no longer a competitive market. But in the last kind of few months, along with kind of campaigning for their students, a lot of universities, £9,000 in 2010 is not £9,000 now. So are campaigning for more money. And it'd be good to kind of chat about where the universities are sitting on this, because obviously they want more money, but they also need the students to come and see this as a valuable option at the same time. If you could just say where you're from and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. So Abby Whiteley, I'm from Universities UK. So it's definitely, from university's perspective, it is a really, really complex issue. So £9,000 in 2012 terms, which is the first year that people were paying, £9,000 fees, I was part of that cohort, is now worth about £6,600. And something that's really important to understand is that when fees went up to £9,000, it wasn't that universities suddenly had triple the money for each student that they had before. So what we call the unit of resource, so the amount of money that a university has to educate each student, is largely comprised of partly of the fee and partly of a central grant that universities just receive from the government for to teach the students that they have. And effectively what the 2012 reforms did is they stacked that more in favour of graduate contributions than in terms of the central grant. So the way that the Scottish system still works is it's just entirely central grant. They obviously don't have any fees for Scottish domiciled students. And in terms of whether it's working for universities, obviously that tuition fee figure hasn't gone up except once in 2016. And the central grant isn't really going up either. So you're seeing a decline in the unit of resource, which means universities are having to deliver a teaching experience that students want, student support, libraries, all those things that they deliver for less and less money. And that's a really complex issue, and obviously universities, they don't want to be standing there saying we want to charge students more. That's not, it's not politically expedient, and it's often not something that, a lot of universities have genuine widening participation agendas. They want people to come to university. They understand students' concerns about debt, but they also do need the funding to be able to actually deliver the education. And, and I think in an ideal world, universities would like the central grant to go up. So then they could just say, we just get this no strings attached money and we're not being pitted against students. So something that's, universities are in a little bit of a corner in the respect that they do want more money in order to be able to educate their students, but they also don't want to be pitted against students in this question of tuition fees. So it's a really thorny issue, particularly for universities.
Yeah. So obviously when I was at university, one of those kind of sticking points was there was Ucu Strikes, so these kind of ongoing strikes from lecturers who we were quite close to, as kind of happens at university. Some of them were PhD students, obviously, so not much older than us, about pay levels, pension levels. So we kind of saw that. We saw vice chancellor salaries. Which is obviously a sticking point. And that became the kind of hot points of discussion. And again, it did feel like we were being pitted against the university at the same time as having a lot of pride for the place that we went to. What's the best kind of mechanisms? Like, what are the levers that groups like University UK are pulling? Is there a way to kind of do this, avoiding the politics and sticking to the financial? Or is this always going to be kind of, how can you avoid the kind of clash with the students, do you think?
That's a really great question. I think ultimately, as we see from the students in the room, I'm sure many of the students online, as I felt as when I was a student, I don't know if there's any way that universities can be asking for example, an uplift to the fee cap without that becoming political and without that pitting them against students. I just don't know if that's possible under the current system. I think there's been a lot of attempts to talk about, well, it's not, you're not paying it now, it's debt and it's income tested and, it's actually quite a progressive system. There's been a lot of attempts on comms on that sort of at that angle, whether you agree with that angle or not. And it's been a decade and I don't think anyone feels any differently. So I just don't think, I think if you wanted to, it's become politically toxic. I think the issue really for universities, for students, for graduates, for staff. And I think if you wanted to make it less political, I don't know if funding education is ever going to be an apolitical topic, but if you wanted to make it less political, I think you'd have to change the system, to be honest.
Okay, so then that's kind of a rethink. Is it possible to come to Lydia Scott online? We can come to her in a second. She's making a good point as the kind of limited unit of resource, which I think would be good to talk about. Can we hear you?
Yeah, so in terms of like universities at the moment.
Yes, yeah. The point about, and also about international students, I think it would be good to have a little bit of that conversation as well.
Yeah, so the way we are at the moment and the things that me and Jim have been telling a lot of our student union officers that we've seen over the country is that as hard as it is to get into the mindset when you are paying a lot of money to go to university and you're getting this debt that we're all talking about that isn't really seen in a positive light, because that's not how it's painted in the media, especially if you're from a low income background and all that, debt doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel nice. No one wants debt. But the fact of the matter of where we are at the moment with this system is that universities, as was mentioned earlier, are stuck with this limited resource at the minute. Like you said, 9,000 in 2012 was very different to 9,000 in 2022. It was very different to 9,000 in even 2020. So where universities are at the moment is they've got a limited amount of money they can get from home domiciled students. So often they are now turning to the international market. International students the UK has always been a big thing for international students, but a lot of universities we're seeing now are almost, sound awful to say, but topping up that money by looking to the international student market, particularly for international one-year PGT courses, because there's no cap. The government doesn't set a cap in that sense. So you can pay loads of different amounts. So what you might pay for UCLan versus what you might pay for Durham University for a postgraduate course, even as a home student, would vary. As an international student, again, it varies there. So if you're paying tens of thousands of pounds, this is just tuition fees, not even covering your costs of living. I think it is very hard to get your head around this idea that your university is struggling for money. It was like that for me as a home student. But the fact of the matter is, where we are at the moment with inflation and the way this system currently works is the university, their unit of resource is frozen. And if you see that as a business sense, the first thing we've seen businesses do at the minute is put prices up. But universities can't do that at the minute. So they do turn to the international student market and to increase in trying to get more home students in. So then you get the bigger class sizes. You now, instead of having a personal tutor now having 20 students, it might have 50. And it's the student experience is potentially worsening. You might have less one-on-one time, all that sort of stuff to kind of make up for that unit of resource freezing. It's kind of just the way we are at the minute, whatever your kind of moral view is. Like, ideally for me, get rid of tuition fees. But realistically, that's not where we are. You know, so it's the way the system works is quite messy. And I don't think many students, like, I've tried to explain this to my sister who's in third year. She's like, yeah, but I don't want to pay. And I'm like, I know you don't, but, and like, I know you don't have sympathy because you think we'll cut the VC salary, but it's not going to top us up the way that we need to be topped up at the minute, you know, for many universities.
So I think obviously, so international salary, like international fees, obviously they're a considerable part. I think I remember a lot of the investment that went to the business schools at my university, which was Exeter. And a lot of the students there were international students, and that was kind of seen as quite accepted that was the top up. To me, that sounds like a sticking plaster. Surely at some point, that's not going to be enough. And correct me if I'm wrong, obviously there's been a lot of changes in Tory conference, but from what I remember, Suella Braverman, the new Home Secretary, was talking about reducing international students. At what point, and I can ask this to the room as well, are we reaching a point where it just kind of tips off the edge and universities turn around and say, we just can't manage ourselves anymore? If we could stick with, if you have an answer to that.
I mean,
Sorry,
I mean, Jim's been at Tory Party conference, so you can go to Jim, but I really don't think that tipping point morally, maybe, but if you're a university who needs more money, like this is just the way the market's been going over the past few years. I've seen a lot of universities over recruit in terms of class size and student experience. I don't think many of them are ready to admit that the thing that they're selling on their shiny brochure to students coming in, who will come in next September, the student experience that you got maybe 2 years ago or this year is not going to be the student experience that you might get in 3 years, but no one wants to have that conversation just yet.
No, that's really helpful. Sophie, can we come to? Is there a mic? Are these talking about you in the chat and talking to people?
No, this is my own thought.
Thank you, Sophie.
I do have them sometimes. I was just going to say, I think that all of this, I mean, the thing about the universities needing more money, and understandably so, you know, inflation, everything that has changed. There's an element of it which is that someone said in the chat earlier, I just don't really understand, even after we kind of explained, I still don't really understand the system and why it's so confusing. I think part of that sometimes seems a little bit by design, certainly from a student perspective, and that actually what somebody's mum told me when I was a student railing against the fact that my fees were so much higher than people's before, my cost of living wasn't great, and I didn't think I was getting an okay education, was that it's better to think of it like a tax, in that you go in and it's basically a higher education tax, and that's how we should be telling students. And I also think it's perfectly reasonable to turn around and say to people, actually, you don't need to go to university. There are so many universities that I think, as Livia was sort of implying, that probably wouldn't, if it was really a free market, they wouldn't run. They would close down shops because the thing they're giving out is not really worth it. And we're having a lot of conversations in the chat about, I think Harvard was mentioned, and that it's not necessarily about having a degree, it's where you got your degree from. Yeah. And I think that's already starting to happen more with sort of masters and things. Lots of jobs like at the UN or various other these sort of big jobs will say now you need to have a master's degree, and often that needs to be from somewhere sort of pretty fancy and pretty expensive. Yeah. And I kind of wonder, are we just sort of telling a lie? I feel like we are lying to 18-year-olds and saying that, one, it's a loan. It's not a loan. It's not debt. It's a tax. Two, we're going to change how we're taxing you. because that's essentially what the government is saying to us now, you and I paying off our threshold. And 3, you don't need to go to university. And I don't know if we did get one of the apprentices from Multiverse here, but I would really love to hear what you think, because we don't. Yeah, there you go. I'll set the floor for you. I don't know if we need to be telling 18-year-olds that that's the only way. I think Tony Blair's education. Yes, that's one system for it, but actually people have managed to not go to university and done incredibly well. Andrew Gerd was saying he doesn't like employing people that went to university. Sorry if I've slightly misphrased that, but I think that's totally right. Why is it this kind of thing that you have to do? Okay. I'll end my rant now.
That's okay.
So my name's Eamon, and I'm doing an apprenticeship with UCL actually, so I can offer like a different perspective in terms of
That'd be really helpful.
yeah, and in terms of my apprenticeship provider is Multiverse, which was actually founded by Tony Blair's oldest son. So you got to be. So essentially, I don't think student loans work in the way that it's intended to, because I do feel I'm a British Muslim, and in terms of my community, in terms of the Sharia law, in terms of how we abide, in terms of how we live our life, it's not valid to take a student loan. So from there, we have some sort of, in terms of university deprivation, in terms of from the people from Islamic background. So I feel that essentially student loans, they don't work in that sense, and they're not really accessible, and they're supposed to be accessible, but they're not accessible to because we are lucky to live in such a multicultural, diverse society where we have different talents and from different ways of life, and I don't feel that student loans actually harness that. And I'm doing an apprenticeship with UCL, and within my day-to-day role, I see the impact in terms of people think that you don't need an apprenticeship to succeed. I think we should break free from the shackles and the stigma that you need to go to university. University is a traditional route. And I think times are changing in terms of people. I think we're going to come to a point when we see that universities are an alternative to apprenticeships, because they're high-level apprenticeships, degree, master. Actually, the other day I was reading that you can actually do an apprenticeship in medicine now. So we've really, it's not just it's vocational, just not in technical in terms of engineering, manufacturing. We've really come from that scope to a wide scope in terms of finance, banking, and I'm doing a digital business accelerator course. And within my course, I'm learning in terms of Power BI, Excel, spreadsheet management, inventory management. And within my role, I feel that I've learned a wide scope of itineraries, and I feel that I would have not learned it if I went to university. And I actually got a university place last year to do marketing management at Queen Mary, and I turned that down, firstly in terms of the interest rates, but also in terms of, I think my experience that the classroom environment I wouldn't learn, because if you think about it, break it down, 3 years, first year you don't really get your act together, you're just trying to find out how everything is. Let's be realistic here. Second year, you're trying to build your way slowly, and the third year, that's when everything just hits you in the head. You just focus. That's what I've learned from our fellow peers.
It's quite right.
Yeah, essentially. And if you've got a fourth year, then you've got a bit of extra time. But I feel that in terms of an apprenticeship, you can actually develop your skills on the job. And if you think about it, you do a degree in psychology, finance, and you go into a completely different scope, not even in terms of what you've actually trained to do. You go into a completely different scope. And within that role, if you think about it, the university degree, you're going to have to be trained in terms of the role, how to do HR management, in terms of how to do stakeholder management. It's not like you don't learn all about university, no matter what they tell you. University is theory, but the practical element is far from that. So I know I'm taking the floor a bit.
No, I think it's really important. I also think those voices are not obviously heard in the round, and those, which is why we really wanted people from Multiverse to come along. And and I think it's also important to say, as a journalist, so I did a journalism masters, and that came with the NCTJ, which is kind of a bit outdated in terms of journalism world. It's a national qualification, but actually even that additional module, which I paid extra for on top of my master's degree, and I couldn't get a loan for, gave me more skills and more ability, and that people run fast track courses just in that, and they've come out with exactly the same experience as my £10,000 masters, and I really had to take stock and go, which is the one that's actually got more value to me, and what's valued by my employers. So it's really, really helpful. So is this a conversation you have in your friendship groups? Is do people turn to you and say, oh, I wish I'd done an apprenticeship instead, or?
Yeah, actually, the other day, because I'm on LinkedIn and I'm ambassador for Multiverse, and essentially I get people contacting me all the time as well as friends, and they mentioned to me the integral part, this integral thing in terms of they went to university, it's not planning out, they want to do an apprenticeship, and they're through their first, second year, and they actually want to drop out of university because they see university as a dead end, while the apprenticeship is a start of something, a start of something positive, it's a spark of something, of your start of your career. You're not, if you think about it, university 3 years on average. If you do an apprenticeship at 18, like I did, when you get to 21, you're already established in your field, you already got a stable job, you already got real life experience, which is actually what employers want. Now it's more desired, because as mentioned before, the market's become really, in terms of saturated, in terms of university degrees, this right, left, right, university degrees popping up all the time. It's no longer distinguishable, and it's also no longer, I think, special and sought after in certain fields. Of course, you've got the medicine and then engineering. Even in engineering, the department I work in at UCL, they offer apprenticeships. So I feel that for some, it does work, the traditional route. We have to give a balanced perspective, because for some, they enjoy the lifestyle and they enjoy gaining the traditional route. But also for many, you can't concentrate in a classroom environment, who struggle to keep focused and do theory work. I think it's a great alternative, and I think it's an alternative that should be explored by everyone.
No, that's really, really helpful. Thank you. I can see Jem, you've got the mic. Are you wanting to talk, or?
Well, I was just going to very briefly say,
Yeah.
When Theresa May's review of post-18 fees and funding concluded a couple of years ago, it concluded that, sure, we've hit Blair's target for 50% participation in university, but we should worry about the 50% of people who don't go to university. We are not going to fix that problem by persuading a chunk of people who do go to university to switch to the other route. We need to focus on the 50% of people who don't go to university. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the multiverse model, degree apprenticeships, persuading employers to put more money in, because it's employers who end up funding it. But there are two different debates, and it is silly for us to assume that we fix the 50% who don't get skills in our current system by persuading a handful of people who go to university to switch to a vocational route. We've got to find the money to invest in that half, rather than obsessing over this 4% of people who might be on a dead-end university course, who might be better on a more practical course, when lots of university courses are practical anyway. And I guess what I would say is, once this conversation ends up talking about the other 50%, it becomes so big that it's impossible then to focus on the funding mechanism. So.
No. I think, and obviously it is a huge debate. I'm very, very aware, and I know that we've only got 15 minutes left, and we've got a lot more to talk about. I think the points I said at the beginning, right, were kind of, is it working for students? I think a lot. We've kind of said, as students, you've said otherwise, and I think, is it working for universities? It doesn't sound like it is working for universities currently, at least in terms of, their goals and their funding models. But is it working as what it was intended to do, which is to provide skills? And to your point, if it was working, it's not working for the 50% who are going to university. We haven't got another model for the other 50%. I don't know what, because I know at the moment people are kind of saying, well, just more people go to universities, become more skilled, and I don't. Obviously, you've heard a lot about levelling up, and anyway, I'm going to go down a track in my mind about, and I don't really have a solution. But if there's anyone online who's like, you know what, here's what we do for everyone, and everyone's going to come and be really skilled, then I'm sure there's a job opening in cabinet for you at some point. But I also, if we can, I know we've got some people here from Speakers for Schools, and I'd really like to talk a little bit about how we kind of talk to primary and secondary education as they come into this conversation, and a bit of literacy on that. If you got, any of you from Speakers for Schools, because I think this isn't an education point, it's about kind of the conversations you have about student loans and the value you see in them as kind of a goal, as university as a goal as well, in terms of social mobility especially.
Yeah, well, we don't really talk to students about finance education at all, do we? Speakers for Schools is a social mobility charity, so we offer work experience, we introduce employers, we introduce different pathways, and an introduction to universities. I think, lost my breath. I think what we find is with social mobility and universities and paying, like, how can you go to university? It's too much money. Find an apprenticeship. How will someone from a state school become a judge, a lawyer, a doctor if they can't afford university? So I think with the student loans, the way they're going, we're widening the gap of where young people can get to from state school educations. in my school, we didn't learn about loans and debt and percentages and APR. We don't know what that is. I still don't really. So how would anyone from a state school education who grows up on an estate with universal credit know what all of this means? Maybe I'll just go for an apprenticeship. Maybe I'll go for a plumbing course in my local area because that's what my school introduces to me. But I mean, all of this just widens the gap more for state school kids. And what we're trying to do is bring employers into schools to introduce different pathways, different careers, different opportunities. But we will still see the distance between someone from my council estate becoming a judge or a barrister or a politician, because it will only be the rich who can afford, or people who have the bank of mum and dad to take them into uni, to help them get a flat, to buy them a house. That's a whole other challenge for everyone. It just widens the gap more. And I think what we're doing at our charity is to introduce different pathways and show that you don't have to go to university, but the gap will grow.
And I think I agree as well. I guess the question I was trying to say is that education point about kind of understanding, because then you wouldn't have these people coming in and being like, look, I don't want to take on £50,000 of debt, because if we can have the conversation about what, in reality, what that's going to mean. Sarah's got the mic though, so I'm going to come to Sarah, and then I might come online again. I'm just going to check on the chat as well. But I'm interested to know what you have to say, seeing as you're not from England. So.
Oh, this isn't about me being an international student. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Although
I'm interested to hear you for what you've
I
got to
can
say.
talk about that if you want.
No.
I think I've just had this question swimming in my mind for a bit that maybe Abby, you could answer, which is in terms of universities raising the fees to match how inflation works, is it because they're currently in debt, or is it because their profit margins aren't being hit in the manner in which they want them to be?
Thanks, that's a great question.
Yeah.
So in sort of public sector, we talk about deficit and surplus, but that's fine. So in terms of, there are only a small proportion of universities that are in deficit or have been over the last few years. It's quite a small proportion of the, certainly of our membership. So we work with all of the kind of large universities that you've probably heard of. There's a whole independent university sector of very, very small providers, which probably aren't the institutions that we're talking about now. But in terms of the reason they're requiring further funding, effectively, is universities make a loss on domestic teaching. They make a significant loss on research, and we haven't really come on to research funding for understandable reasons, because it's not student-facing, but they do make a really big loss on research. And then they need to find cross-subsidy elsewhere. And this is where often the international students come in. It may be where working with businesses comes in.
Yeah.
So effectively, their basic model, in terms of what they receive from government, they make a loss. So the reason they need more money is to actually fill that gap.
Wait, sorry, I'm a bit confused. So there's only a few that are in deficit, but
Yes.
all of them are making a loss?
They're making a loss on domestic teaching and on research.
But
so
they're not making a loss overall?
Not overall, no. So it's they make a loss on those streams, and then they need to find cross-subsidy elsewhere. And that might come from international students, it might come from working with businesses, or offering courses in other areas. So holistically, across the whole sector, only a handful of institutions are actually in deficit as a whole company, if you like. But they all have that need, effectively, to find that top up somewhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it really raises for me the question, which is why, if we all think education is a public service, why they need to be oriented towards profit. Like, I don't think we think a lot of institutions which are public services, they have to be sort of in the black, so to speak. As long as they're breaking even, shouldn't that be enough? Like,
well, that's the aim. They need to break even. They need
Yeah.
to create more cross-subsidy in order to break even. By default, on public funding, they make a loss. So it's not about making a surplus, and obviously all institutions need to make a small surplus for things like COVID that might happen, where they suddenly need to cover that. But it's not about, they're not trying to, with the exception of a few very large institutions, most don't make like massive surpluses. Most of them are just trying to get by, basically.
Yeah, see, I think the question you're kind of getting down to though is that the idea is to create a marketplace, right? A kind of marketplace of universities and options for students, because if the idea of that kind of flow of money is this: the student takes the loan, the student goes to university, they receive a service, they kind of give some of that money to the local economy, to the university itself. They may go on to do research, which is significant because there is a pathway. It's a small pathway, but it is a pathway. You know, research is helpful in pandemics. But then that they then go out into the wider marketplace, the economy, and they come in with skills that we require, which is kind of where apprenticeships are filling the gaps, and then they, support the economy that way. Something that actually I thought was quite interesting was we're beginning to see this trend towards home ownership and people who have student loans. It doesn't affect your credit score as a loan. It does and can potentially, to a small amount, impact obviously your monthly finances. Therefore, when you're saving to buy a home or you're looking to have a mortgage, it is a finance that comes out of your account. Therefore, it has an impact, a small impact. And I think maybe it's important to say there is that I'm probably, between me and maybe my sister who's 2 years older, are the first cohort of people who are coming into the end of their 20s and are looking to home ownership. They're looking to kind of have children to kind of benefit the economy in that way. They are also more likely to be a Conservative voter if they are owning a home, which is a point that was raised to me by our political editor, Kat. So, I feel like we're reaching this kind of moment where we're going to move forward on it. And I don't know if that's just in my head, it's just the conversations I'm having. But I think that's worth us as tortoise kind of thinking about. We're in the last few minutes. If we can, I just want to come to Tricia Sibbins just quickly, and then I'm going to try and summarise. But mostly I've got more questions. So if we come to Tricia, because I think you made the point about public good, which I think would be kind of nice to finish on. If you could, can we hear you?
Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting to speak, but thank you for asking me.
Yeah, they have to speak at the Thinkins if you put your hand up.
I just think we've got the whole debate the wrong way round. And actually, Bruce Davis makes the point, if you want to control education, which is where new ideas and the odd revolution come from, then shackle education, shackle people in education with debt. And I think you can't get away from the politics. We're talking about the system, when we're talking about a funding model, that is just at the end of the debate. We have to go all the way back to people as old as I am that remember, I didn't go to university. I went to a polytechnic, and then I paid myself to do a master's, which I was very happy to do because I could do it when I could afford it. But I didn't feel like I missed out going to the person that spoke earlier in the room. I found something that worked for me. So I think I agree with the broadness of the public good of public education and higher education, and that there should be a broad menu available, and that is valued in different ways. I mean, you just need to look at COVID and say, where were we short of people? It wasn't bankers, people. The debate is political, and if you start to move away from that as students, I'm sorry, you're going to be on your own. But if you want us to stick with you and try and get a better, more affordable public good education, then we've got to come together intergenerationally so we can point out things that maybe are missed. But actually, at the end of the day, it comes down to the politics. The market is bankrupt. I'm not a Marxist, but the market is bankrupt. And if we continue to feed the conversation about university being markets, we've lost the point of higher education. I'll stop there.
No, thank you, Tricia. I think it's a good point to kind of take a step back on at the end. It's good. Also, we'll point out it's my dad in the chat kind of arguing on that point. So he was very for me going to university. But I think we should kind of come to a kind of end. I don't think we are at the end of the conversation. As I said, we kind of started off thinking about whether or not it works for students. I think at the moment, it's harder to answer that. There's a kind of a yes and a no. Universities, I think, are facing a really important decision about what they need, what's the future, what does it look like, how do they avoid the kind of the cycle and the churn that comes through the political systems. If we want to talk about the public good that universities are doing, we need to think about apprenticeships, we need to think about the 50% and the other 50%, and focus less on these kind of minute details like vice chancellors' pay and inflation and interest rates and what they mean. But there's some really important things I think that we can work on to dig into. I'm going to be writing something up in an attempt to make sense of this for our daily sense maker email. And I think we're not going to kind of let this one go. And it's quite hard to keep track of who's education secretary at the moment, but we will try and put that to them, whoever they may be, by next week, and kind of keep the scrutiny going, because it's a really important conversation, and it's very slow because we're really talking about the next 40, 50 years, which is very tortoise-like. But thank you all for coming in the room. Thank you all for being so vocal online. It's been really great to see. If you have any thoughts, yes, Sophie's just put my email in the chat. Please send me them. I really want to get them in my inbox, and we'll try and filter them together into the sense maker. But yeah, thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.